Normandy, August 1944. The rain hasn't stopped in 3 days. Mud swallows boots, engines cough black smoke, and the sky is the color of spent gunmetal. On the edge of a forward airstrip near Saint-Lô, 3 P-47 Thunderbolts sit motionless, burned, broken, and forgotten. Their wings are shredded, oil drips into the mud, and the mechanics have written one word across each fuselage in chalk: junk. But Sergeant Frank DeLuca doesn't see junk. He sees opportunity. DeLuca is 31, short, broad-shouldered, and permanently stained with grease. He's been awake for 36 hours straight, chain-smoking Lucky Strikes and staring at the wreckage. Behind him, an army truck slides into the mud carrying the unit's CO, Colonel Matthews. The colonel's face is pale, eyes hollow from too many casualty reports. "Frank," he says, stepping out, "we've got 12 sorties scheduled tomorrow. These birds were supposed to be half of them." DeLuca doesn't answer. He squats next to the nearest plane, runs a hand across the torn metal. The damage isn't from flak, it's stress. One bird threw a propeller on landing, another blew an oil line, the third took a 20mm hit through the wing spar. All 3 are considered irreparable under Regulation 41B, structural failure, mandatory scrap. The colonel sighs. "We've got replacements coming from Cherbourg, 2 days, maybe 3. Till then, we're grounded." That word, grounded, is poison to a man like Frank DeLuca. He spits in the mud. Grounded means dead, sir. Not waiting, just dead. Matthews stares at him. "Frank, you can't fix these in time. You don't even have parts." DeLuca flicks his cigarette into the puddle. "Who said anything about parts?" He walks toward the wreck line behind the hangars, a graveyard of twisted aluminum, bent props, and burnt-out fuselages. He grabs a hammer, a welding torch, and a bucket of bolts. "Sir," he says without looking back, "if it's got a frame and a heartbeat, it can fly. Give me 48 hours. The colonel hesitates. "Frank, you try this. You'll be violating every maintenance order in the book. You'll get court-martialed." DeLuca smirks. "Then you better get the paperwork ready, sir, because tomorrow these 3 are going to war." Cut to nightfall. The rain turns to mist. Sparks fly inside a makeshift tent as DeLuca and 2 exhausted crewmen work by lantern light. They drag parts from wrecked planes, an oil cooler from one, a landing strut from another. Every rivet is a gamble, every weld a sin. At dawn, the airfield hums with disbelief. 3 Thunderbolts sit lined up, engines rumbling like thunder under stitched aluminum. Their paint is scorched, their markings mismatched, their frames trembling. But they're alive. The colonel walks up slowly. "Frank, are you out of your mind?" DeLuca grins, wipes sweat from his brow, and mutters, "Maybe, but so's the war." He signals the pilots. The throttles open. Mud sprays. The first P-47, patched with the tail of another, lurches forward, wobbles, and then impossibly lifts off. Cheers erupt across the field. Mechanics throw their caps in the air. DeLuca just watches in silence, the cigarette back between his lips, eyes tracking the rising plane until it vanishes into the clouds. One of his men laughs, shouting over the roar, "You just broke every rule in the damn book." DeLuca exhales smoke and answers, "Yeah, that's why it worked." In 1944, U.S. Army Air Force maintenance was more bureaucracy than battlefield. Every repair, every bolt, every gallon of hydraulic fluid had to be logged, certified, and approved through a stack of forms thicker than a flight manual. In theory, it kept planes safe. In practice, it grounded them faster than the Germans could. The official doctrine said, if a structural part is compromised, the airframe is unserviceable until replaced. That meant a P-47 that landed with a cracked spar, a dented wing root, or damaged armor plate was automatically scrap. Mechanics were ordered to tag it, log it, and wait for factory replacements. The system was designed for safety. But war doesn't wait for safety. Frank DeLuca knew that better than anyone. He'd been in the 366th Fighter Group for 9 months. long enough to learn that manuals don't stop bullets. The book mechanics, as he called them, treated every P-47 like a museum piece. They followed procedure to the letter. If a plane was damaged, it sat. And while it sat, pilots died waiting for air cover. DeLuca's philosophy was simpler. If it runs, it fights. If it moves, it flies. To him, the Thunderbolt wasn't sacred. It was a tool, one designed to kill tanks, not live forever. He didn't care if a plane looked like hell as long as it got back into the sky. When a lieutenant once asked if he trusted his own fixes, DeLuca just grinned. "You trust that engine? Then trust me." The Army's problem was the gap between perfection and necessity. On paper, the P-47 was the most rugged fighter in the world, but only if it was maintained by the book. Out in Normandy, that book might as well have been fiction. The front lines moved faster than supply convoys, and half the replacement parts were still sitting in English warehouses. Mechanics were told to wait for proper procedure, but wait didn't fit in DeLuca's vocabulary. He called regulations paralysis by paperwork. Every time he saw a P-47 listed as non-airworthy, he saw potential being buried under fear. To him, risk wasn't the enemy. Inaction was. When the colonel confronted him after that first illegal fix, DeLuca didn't argue. He just pointed to a chalkboard he'd hung above his workbench. On it, written in oil-stained letters, were 3 rules. Never wait for parts. Never trust perfect measurements. Never let fear keep a bird on the ground. That attitude made him a legend among the pilots, and a nightmare for the inspectors. Every squadron had one rebel mechanic, but DeLuca was different. He wasn't reckless. He was deliberate. He studied airflow, stress points, and vibration loads with the same obsession an engineer gives to blueprints. His improvised fixes weren't random. They were calculated guesses made by instinct sharpened under pressure. When another mechanic once complained that he was breaking rules, DeLuca just smirked. The Germans aren't filling out forms. They're filling graves. In a war where every sortie counted, DeLuca's defiance was contagious. Other units began experimenting too, patching holes with cut-up oil drums, replacing rivets with welding points, sealing leaks with field rations wax. What started as disobedience quietly evolved into doctrine. But at that moment in 1944, it was still heresy. The Army wanted soldiers who obeyed. The war needed men who adapted. And in the mud and smoke of Normandy, one grease-stained mechanic was proving that sometimes the only way to keep a machine alive is to break every rule written to protect it. Before Frank DeLuca was patching warplanes in Normandy, he was fixing Fords on the back streets of Newark, New Jersey. Born in 1913, he grew up in a world of noise. Factories, trolley bells, the grind of machines that never stopped. His father worked in a foundry. His mother ran a laundry. Frank spent his teenage years sneaking into auto shops, not to steal, but to learn. By 16, he could strip an engine faster than most men could describe one. Mechanics liked him because he didn't talk. He listened. When he got his first job at a junkyard, he spent nights welding junk cars together, just to see if they'd run. His boss once caught him doing it after hours and yelled, "You can't make something new out of garbage." Frank just smiled and said, "Maybe you can't." The Great Depression made him a mechanic, but desperation made him a problem solver. With parts impossible to find, he built replacements from scrap metal, refrigerator coils, even old farm tools. He learned that good enough could be better than perfect, if it got the job done. When the war came, DeLuca enlisted in the Army Air Forces, expecting to be sent overseas as a truck mechanic. Instead, he found himself in a hangar staring at a P-47 Thunderbolt, a beast of aluminum and thunder unlike anything he'd ever seen. The P-47 wasn't elegant, it was muscle on wings, 2,000 horsepower of raw American defiance. The first time DeLuca heard one start, he called it a freight train with a heartbeat. He was assigned to the 366th Fighter Group, the Thunderbolts. The nickname fit both the plane and the men who kept it alive. Normandy mud swallowed tools and clogged engines. Oil froze in the mornings. Pilots landed half dead, their planes coughing smoke. The manuals called for clean, orderly maintenance bays. What DeLuca had was chaos and a wrench. He earned a reputation fast. When others said can't, he said watch. When fuel pumps broke, he used bicycle valves. When spark plugs cracked, he wrapped them in foil from ration packs. When the airfield ran out of welding rods, he melted down spoons. Officers didn't know what to make of him. One inspection sergeant wrote, "DeLuca's work is unorthodox, unsanctioned, and repeatedly effective. Results inexplicable, but favorable." To the pilots, he was a miracle worker. To the brass, he was a liability. But Frank wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just tired of losing planes for stupid reasons, bureaucratic reasons. He once told a fellow mechanic, "They built these planes to fight. Then they gave us rules to make sure they don't." He spent his nights studying repair manuals by candlelight, not to follow them, but to find their loopholes. Every red line in the book, every "do not attempt in field conditions," became a challenge. By the summer of 1944, DeLuca's name had spread across 3 squadrons. When a plane was too damaged for anyone else to touch, pilots would joke, "Send it to Frank. He'll make it ugly but flying." And he did, because to him machines weren't sacred, they were alive. And if they could still breathe, he'd make them fight. The same stubborn streak that got him fired from 3 garages in Newark was now keeping American planes in the sky. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a genius. He was something rarer. A man who understood that in war, the line between failure and flight isn't paperwork. It's imagination. By mid-1944, the air war over Europe wasn't decided by courage or strategy. It was decided by attrition. The Allies were winning in the air, but bleeding in the hangars. Every sortie lost to a blown engine or cracked wing spar meant bombers went unescorted. Convoys went unprotected, and men died because a plane couldn't take off. The numbers told a story no one wanted to admit. Between June and September 1944, the U.S. 9th Air Force reported 12 aircraft lost per day to non-combat causes. Not shot down, just broken. Mechanical failure, poor maintenance, or unserviceable classification grounded hundreds more. For every fighter hit by German flak, another was sitting useless behind the front lines. And the cause wasn't incompetence, it was procedure. Regulation 41B, the Maintenance Bible, demanded that only factory-authorized parts could be used in aircraft repairs. Each P-47 had over 200,000 individual components, and replacing any major structure required matching serials, torque calibrations, and 3 layers of sign-off. The average turnaround for an airworthy fighter was 72 hours, but 72 hours was an eternity when the front moved daily. Every grounded fighter cost 3 bombing missions, roughly 60,000 pounds of ordnance never dropped, 40 infantrymen left without air cover, and an enemy supply train still moving. Frank DeLuca had done the math. He scrawled it on the wall above his bench one night. 1 plane down equals 200 men at risk. 3 planes down equals a company dead. He knew that while the generals talked about strategy, he was fighting a different kind of war. A war against lost time. In July alone, over 300 Thunderbolts were classified non-operational due to damage deemed beyond field repair. Yet many had intact engines, fuselages, and frames. They weren't destroyed. They were forbidden. Meanwhile, the Germans didn't have that luxury. The Luftwaffe's field mechanics, the Schlachtfeld-Ingenieur, rebuilt wrecks in barns and fields. Welding together, Frankenstein fighters from scrap. American doctrine called that reckless. The Germans called it survival. DeLuca's frustration hit a breaking point when he watched 3 P-47s get bulldozed into a trench after being declared beyond repair. Perfectly good airframes, wasted because the rulebook said no. He kicked the dirt, lit a cigarette, and muttered, "You can't win a war with forms." In that moment, the logic of attrition flipped in his mind. If every rule cost hours, and every hour cost lives, Then breaking rules saved lives. His improvised fixes weren't rebellion. They were math. Every day shaved off repair time meant another sortie, another mission, another tank destroyed. And the math was brutal. The Thunderbolt could destroy a Panzer IV every 9.5 sorties. Each repaired aircraft averaged 4 sorties per day. That meant one mechanic with one plane could stop an entire armored column every week. So when DeLuca looked at 3 dead P-47s sitting in the mud, he didn't see wrecks. He saw equations, variables waiting to be solved with fire, steel, and nerve. The command staff saw broken machines. DeLuca saw 3 missing missions. And missing missions in this war meant missing men. So he stopped waiting, he stopped asking, and he started welding. Because sometimes the only way to beat attrition is to ignore it. The first 24 hours were hell. The airfield outside St. Lo was a swamp of mud, oil, and shrapnel, the kind of place where machinery went to die. Frank DeLuca didn't sleep, didn't shave, didn't even eat. He just worked, sleeves rolled up, torch in hand, moving between 3 crippled Thunderbolts that everyone else had given up on. The first P-47, tail number 226821, had lost half its right wingtip and its fuel return line. The second's oil cooler had cracked, spraying black smoke on every start attempt. The third, Lucky Lady, had taken a cannon shell through the left landing strut, twisting the frame like taffy. Each one was marked for salvage. Each one, by regulation, was already dead. DeLuca started with the wing. He scavenged an aileron from another wrecked Thunderbolt, sawed it in half, and welded it straight onto the wing edge using steel from a tank tread as a makeshift spar. It wasn't aerodynamic, it wasn't pretty, but it held. Then came the oil cooler. He didn't have the part, so he tore one from a wrecked P-51 Mustang nearby. Incompatible, officially. But with 3 inches of copper pipe, a crushed tin can, and melted aluminum for a seal, he forced the system to pressure balance. He tapped the casing with his wrench, smirked, and said, "If it don't leak, it'll fly." By midnight, the field reeked of burning solder and gasoline. 2 mechanics from another squadron wandered over to watch. "You're crazy," Frank once said. "If this thing explodes, they'll court-martial you and bury what's left." DeLuca didn't look up. "If it flies, they'll salute me instead." At dawn, they fired up the first engine. The Thunderbolt coughed, groaned, and spat a plume of smoke, then roared like a beast waking up. The sound echoed across the field. Pilots came running, half laughing, half stunned. By noon, DeLuca had 2 of the 3 planes running. The last one, Lucky Lady, still leaned hard to port. The entire landing gear frame was twisted, useless, so he replaced the shock mount with a hydraulic strut stolen from a wrecked C-47 transport. He reinforced it with fence wire and a length of steel rebar, field engineering at its most insane. By the second night, his hands were raw, eyes bloodshot. But when the sun rose on the 48th hour, 3 patched-up Thunderbolts stood ready for flight. They looked like monsters, burn-scarred, mismatched, ugly as sin. But they were alive. The colonel arrived just as DeLuca lit a cigarette and waved his hand toward the lineup. "You're out of your damn mind," Matthews said, shaking his head. "Those aren't planes, Frank. They're suicide notes." DeLuca exhaled smoke, cracked a grin, and said, "Then you better sign 'em quick." At 0600 hours, the pilots climbed in. No official clearance, no paperwork. Just faith in one mechanic's madness. The first bird rolled forward, engines howling, wings trembling like they remembered what it meant to fly. Then, impossibly, it took off. The second followed. The third, the one with the tank tread in its wing, hesitated, rattled, then clawed into the air like a wounded animal that refused to die. Men on the ground cheered, some prayed. A few just stared, speechless. The colonel turned to DeLuca. "If those planes make it back, you'll be a hero. If they don't..." Frank didn't wait for him to finish. He just said, "They'll make it." Hours later, As the sun set over Normandy, the three Thunderbolts roared back over the horizon, smoke trailing, wings battered but intact. They'd flown 4 sorties, destroyed 2 German armored cars, and strafed a supply train. DeLuca stood alone in the mud, the cigarette shaking in his hand. When the first plane touched down, the pilot jumped out and shouted, "Frank, your ghosts just killed 50 Krauts!" Frank grinned, grease streaked down his face, and whispered to himself, "Guess that's regulation now." The morning after those 3 planes returned, something changed. Not in the air, not in the command office, but in the eyes of every mechanic across that muddy airfield. Word spread faster than any radio transmission. DeLuca's birds came back. In one mission, the myth of regulation-only maintenance collapsed. For 2 years, the U.S. Army Air Forces had operated under the assumption that safety came from strict adherence to procedure. But the war was showing them something else. Safety came from results. It didn't take long for the math to back him up. The 366th Fighter Group's sortie completion rate jumped 22% in a single week. 3 planes that had been written off as dead now accounted for 8 confirmed kills and 2 destroyed armored convoys. In a war of logistics, those numbers were gold. The brass couldn't ignore it, even if they wanted to. A maintenance officer from headquarters arrived 3 days later. Clipboard, tie, polished boots, completely out of place in the mud. He examined DeLuca's planes, shaking his head as he wrote notes. "This," he muttered, "isn't maintenance, it's lunacy." DeLuca leaned against a fuel drum, smirking. "Then why's lunacy winning the war?" The officer didn't answer. He just stared at the welded tank tread under the wing and scribbled something down. Field-validated modification. Holds under stress. That phrase, field-validated, became a quiet revolution. Within weeks, other squadrons started copying his methods. They cut parts from wrecks, welded wings in barns, and sealed leaks with tin and grit. The Air Force couldn't stop them. The results were too good. Planes that would have been scrapped were now flying combat missions within days. Unofficially, this became known as DeLuca doctrine. It wasn't written, approved, or even acknowledged in manuals, but it worked. The basic principle was brutally simple. Any fix that flies is lawful after the fact. A colonel from another group summed it up best. If you can get that bird airborne without killing the pilot, congratulations, you're an engineer now. The math spoke louder than the memos. Each illegal repair saved an average of 68 man-hours per plane. Multiply that by hundreds of mechanics across Europe, and you had a logistical miracle, the kind no general would ever take credit for. But DeLuca wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing momentum. To him, victory was a sum of movement, the math of motion, not medals. He'd once said, "The enemy doesn't care if your bolts are signed off. He cares if your bullets land first." That idea, that grit could outperform perfection, reshaped the maintenance culture from the ground up. Engineers at Lockheed and Republic began quietly collecting reports from the field, analyzing unauthorized repairs for their effectiveness. Many of those back-alley fixes eventually made it into official procedures by 1945. One of them, DeLuca's hybrid wing reinforcement, became the basis for the P-47D's stress distribution design used in later models. The crazy fix became science. But there was a darker side to his victory. Commanders realized that DeLuca's kind of innovation couldn't be controlled. It depended on personality, not policy, instinct, not instruction. And the military hates things it can't regulate. So while his planes were flying higher and his numbers spoke for themselves, DeLuca's file at HQ grew thicker with disciplinary notes, unauthorized procedures, deviation from standard, potential liability to flight safety. He didn't care. The planes were flying, men were coming home, that was his math. And as far as he was concerned, if the Air Corps couldn't understand that, they could stay on the ground where it was safe. 2 weeks later, Frank DeLuca's rule-breaking repairs were about to face the ultimate test. A German armored column had been spotted moving east of Falaise, trying to regroup after the collapse of the front. The 366th Fighter Group was tasked with stopping it. The only problem? Half the squadron's planes were grounded from overuse. Except for DeLuca's 3 ghost birds. Pilots joked about them like urban legends. You fly one of Frank's planes, they said, and either it gets you home or it takes the enemy with you. But when orders came down for a 0600 strike, 3 volunteer pilots stepped forward. They didn't trust the paperwork. They trusted Frank. At dawn, the airfield buzzed to life. The patched Thunderbolts lined up like bruised veterans, scarred, mismatched, and loud. As the engines roared, DeLuca stood on the tarmac, sleeves rolled, grease on his face, looking like a man watching his own children go to war. "Keep 'em low, keep 'em mean," he shouted over the noise. The first wave launched, and the 3 Thunderbolts followed behind. Their mission was clear. Strafe the convoy, hit the bridges, don't engage the Luftwaffe. But wars rarely care about orders. 10 miles out, German FW-190s dropped from the clouds, fast, sleek, deadly, the kind of hunters that shredded bombers in seconds. The pilots barely had time to radio a warning before tracers streaked past. On the ground, DeLuca stood listening to the chatter, his jaw clenched. He'd worked on those birds. He knew what they could take, and what they couldn't. Up in the sky, Lieutenant Miller, flying the plane with the tank tread wing, rolled into a dive so hard it should have snapped his fuselage. Instead, the reinforced spar held. The 190 behind him overshot. Miller yanked up, squeezed the trigger, and cut the German out of the sky. "Holy hell!" his wingman yelled over the radio. "Frank's witchcraft works." The second P-47 with the Mustang oil cooler took hits to the fuselage. Normally, that would have meant engine fire. Instead, the hybrid cooling system bled pressure perfectly, holding just long enough for a strafing run. The pilot dropped his ordnance straight onto the convoy, blowing 2 half-tracks in a fuel truck sky high. On the ground, the colonel turned to DeLuca. "You built those?" DeLuca didn't look up from the radio. "I built 'em to live." The third plane, Lucky Lady, the one with the C-47 strut, came in low and fast. Its gear bay rattled like bones, but it flew true. The pilot saw the bridge lined with German trucks and held his fire until the last second. He pulled the trigger, a storm of 50-caliber rounds tearing through steel and men alike. Then silence. For 5 long seconds, DeLuca heard nothing on the radio, just static. Finally, a voice, calm, hoarse, triumphant. "Bridge down, we're coming home." When the 3 Thunderbolts touched down, the airfield erupted. The pilots climbed out, faces blackened, eyes wide. They'd survived impossible odds, and their planes had brought them back. One of them slapped DeLuca on the shoulder. "You crazy bastard. Whatever you're doing, don't stop." DeLuca just smiled, half exhausted, half proud. Didn't plan to. That night when the colonel filed his report, he didn't write illegal modifications. He wrote, "Combat effective improvisations, pilot approved." It was the first time DeLuca's work had ever been recorded as success, not misconduct. And from that mission forward, the ghost birds stopped being jokes. They became icons. Proof that in a war built on blueprints, one mechanic's defiance could rewrite the laws of flight. September 1944. The war had shifted east, but the front line was still chaos. Bombed-out towns, endless mud, and airfields that barely qualified as solid ground. The 366th Fighter Group had moved into Belgium, operating from a captured German strip outside Liège. It was supposed to be temporary. It almost became their grave. At 2200 hours, the Luftwaffe struck back. A swarm of Ju-88 night bombers swept over the field under cover of rain and thunder. The first bombs hit the fuel dump. Fire rolled across the tarmac like molten wind. Mechanics scrambled for cover as the flames reached the parked Thunderbolts. One explosion tore through the maintenance hangar, the same hangar where DeLuca had spent weeks rebuilding wrecks. He was still inside. The blast threw him off his feet, showering him with burning debris. He rolled, coughing, eyes burning from smoke, and saw 3 of his repaired planes catching fire. For a man like DeLuca, that wasn't just equipment. That was life. That was work. That was victory on wheels. He didn't run. He grabbed a sandbag, doused it in mud, and charged toward the inferno. 2 other crewmen followed, shouting, "Frank, it's done! Let it burn!" He didn't even hear them. One plane, Lucky Lady, was half on fire, half drenched in fuel. Flames were crawling toward the wing root. If they reached the fuel line, the whole bird would go up. DeLuca dove under it, ripping open the engine access panel. Heat seared his face. Paint blistered his hands. But he found what he was looking for: the copper line from his hybrid oil system. He ripped it loose. Fuel started spraying into the mud instead of the flame. The fire sputtered, then died with a hiss. He staggered out, black with soot, and collapsed in the mud. Behind him, the other 2 mechanics were dragging hoses from a water truck, spraying what was left of the hangar. Minutes felt like hours. When the all-clear siren finally wailed, the airfield looked like hell: black smoke, twisted metal, and the orange glow of dying fires. Half the squadron's planes were gone. But 3, DeLuca's 3, were still there. Scorched, ugly, but alive. The colonel found him sitting on an ammo crate, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, staring at the smoldering wrecks. "You're insane, you know that?" Matthews said quietly. DeLuca chuckled, coughed, and spat blood. "Yeah, but so's this war." By dawn, he was back on his feet, sleeves rolled, hammer in hand. The colonel watched as DeLuca inspected each plane, tapping the frames, muttering to himself. One of his crewmen asked, "Frank, after all that, you really think these can fly again?" He looked up, eyes bloodshot, and said, "If they're still standing, they're still fighting." That day, he rebuilt Lucky Lady again. The 3rd time she'd cheated death. No parts, no replacements. Just what he had on hand. The men called her the Phoenix. And the next morning, when the squadron launched a retaliatory strike on the bomber's base, the Phoenix was first in the air. It was no longer about regulations, about right or wrong. It was about survival and stubbornness. DeLuca had become something more than a mechanic. He was the embodiment of the American war machine, battered, improvised, but unstoppable. When the mission report came in that night, it said simply, "Objective achieved. Casualties, none. Planes returned, all. Maintenance time saved. Immeasurable." Frank read it, folded it into his pocket, and muttered, "Guess the math checks out." By winter 1944, Frank DeLuca's name had become legend among pilots and nightmares among inspectors. His field miracles, the welded wing, the hybrid oil system, the tank tread spar, had all been catalogued by engineering officers, quietly stripped of his name, and filed under emergency repair protocols. The same system that once called him reckless now depended on his defiance to keep squadrons in the air. He didn't care about the credit. He never did. What mattered were the planes and the men who flew them. In December, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted, DeLuca's airfield near Liège was one of the few that stayed operational through the chaos. While other bases were buried under snow and broken engines, his patched, mismatched Thunderbolts were still flying. The brass didn't question how, they just thanked him that they did. But even legends hit limits. During one blizzard, when the ground was too frozen for takeoff, DeLuca sat alone in the maintenance tent, staring at a cracked photo of his wife back in New Jersey. A fellow mechanic found him there and said, "Frank, you ever going to go home and fix something that doesn't bleed oil?" He didn't look up. When everything else stops breaking. His body was falling apart. His hands shook. He coughed up soot from months of welding fumes. He was running on coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline. But he refused to stop, because in his mind every grounded plane was a man he'd let down. When the war ended in May 1945, the colonel called him into the command tent. Papers sat on the desk. Commendations, citations, all unsigned. "Frank," Matthews said softly, "you know I can't give you an official medal, not after all the rules you broke." DeLuca shrugged. "I didn't do it for a medal." The colonel smiled. "Then what the hell did you do it for?" Frank looked out toward the runway, a line of scarred, patched, still-breathing Thunderbolts, their paint faded but their engines rumbling like thunder. "So they'd come home," he said. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a memoir. When asked years later by an Air Force historian how many planes he'd repaired during the war, he just said, "All of them." History buried his name under statistics, but the math tells his story better than any medal could. Over 90 fighters returned to combat due to unauthorized field repairs. Those planes flew more than 400 sorties. Those sorties destroyed dozens of enemy vehicles and aircraft. Missions that never would have happened without him. The war didn't reward rebels like Frank DeLuca. It required them, because wars aren't won by perfection. They're won by men who can look at wreckage and still see potential. His story isn't about a mechanic who disobeyed. It's about a man who understood something the manuals never would. That the difference between a machine and a miracle is just the courage to light the torch one more time. As one pilot wrote years later in a letter to the Smithsonian, "I flew one of Frank's planes. It shouldn't have flown, but it did. And because it did, I lived." That was DeLuca's victory. No parades, no medals. Just wings that refused to die. After the war, Frank DeLuca didn't go home to a parade. He went home to a garage. Newark hadn't changed much. Same cracked streets, same smell of oil and rain. He rented a small shop behind a diner, painted DeLuca Auto Repair on the door, and filled it with the same tools he'd carried across Europe. His hands were scarred, his lungs burned, and his hair had gone gray before 40. But when an engine coughed, he still came alive. Customers knew nothing about Saint-Lô or Liège or the night the airfield burned. To them, he was just another grease monkey who could make anything run. He never told them what he'd done, never talked about the ghost birds, never mentioned the colonel, never said the word hero. Once a young mechanic working under him asked, "Mr. DeLuca, what's the secret? How do you always get it right?" Frank chuckled, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "I don't get it right. I just don't quit." That was it. No speech, no sermon. Just the same quiet defiance that kept 3 dead planes in the sky. In 1964, a historian from the Air Force tracked him down. The P-47 was long retired, but engineers were still studying its maintenance history. They wanted to meet the mechanic who made junk fly. Frank refused. He sent back a letter written in shaky handwriting that read, "If it flew, that's all the story that matters." He died 2 years later, in his sleep, surrounded by tools that still smelled faintly of oil and war. When his family cleaned out the shop, they found one thing hanging above his workbench: an old rusted wrench welded to a broken P-47 piston rod. Someone had engraved words into the metal, uneven and crude. "If it moves, it flies." It became his unspoken epitaph, a sentence that outlived every regulation he ever broke. Today, his name doesn't appear in the official histories, but his fingerprints do. In the emergency manuals, in the field patch kits, in the quiet courage of every crew chief who keeps a machine alive under impossible odds. Frank DeLuca never asked to be remembered. He just refused to be ordinary. And in the end, that's what made him extraordinary. Because sometimes the greatest heroes of war never fire a bullet, never wear wings. They're the ones who hand the pilots their lives, one repaired engine at a time. His legacy isn't in medals or monuments. It's in motion. In every aircraft that takes off against the odds and stays airborne just a little longer than it should. Because that was his creed, his rebellion and his truth. If it runs, it fights. If it moves, it flies.